Now, please welcome the director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, Nancy Kennedy.
Hello and welcome to night 2 of this year's Straight Talk lecture series, Bootstraps, Myths and Solutions for Economic Mobility. I'm so glad to see all of you here tonight. This is the 15th summer we've presented the Straight Talk lecture series in conjunction with the Raleigh Institute. We at Ollie are proud of this partnership and hope you will enjoy and learn from the series. I'd also like to thank our other campus and community partners listed on the screen. This year, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute will welcome more than 2,600 senior adult learners to campus to explore courses in a variety of topics, from history to hiking, religion to economics, science to yoga, and more. Our members bring with them a wide variety of educational backgrounds, experiences, opinions, and knowledge, filling our classroom with rich discussion. Those discussions are informed by Ollie's Code of Conduct, which reminds our members to engage in dialogue and listen to opposing viewpoints while respecting the dignity of others. Since 2011, Ollie has partnered with the Raleigh Institute to produce this lecture series, inviting audiences to come with an open mind. All activities of Ollie and the Raleigh Institute are nonpartisan and not intended to push a political agenda. Rather, these events are designed to elevate knowledge, facts, and solutions that broaden our perspectives about issues critical to our progress. While these topics can be challenging, when we seek common ground and find value in perspectives beyond our own, we're much more likely to find solutions to this issue and other pressing and complex problems of our time. Please use the QR code that you'll find on your program or on the screen to submit questions for our speakers. Later on, students from the Raleigh Institute's advanced team will come out to ask some of those questions of the speakers. And now I'd like to welcome to the stage my colleague, Julie Meredith, Director of the Raleigh Institute's Center for Critical Issues, to introduce our speakers and serve as tonight's moderator.
Good evening, everyone. Last week, we started this series by looking at education as a key influencer in creating conditions for the American dream to be within reach for all. We were confronted with the challenges that we as a country must address for all students to have a fair shake, and we examined how we might forge pathways for better economic outcomes. Tonight, we're looking at the impact of work in achieving upward economic mobility. Dr. Chandra will kick off this session tonight by spotlighting how labor and workforce policies make the concept of hard work pays off a lived reality or just a pipe dream for workers. After her keynote remarks, local business leaders David Lominack and Ray Lattimore will join in conversation with Dr. Childers to consider what efforts, changes, and policies are needed for upward economic mobility to expand, especially here in the upstate. Tonight's program will tee us up for our final session next week on September 16th, when we look how the places where we live shape our trajectories and what it will take for the American dream to become more attainable across our communities. To begin tonight's session, it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Chandra Childers. Dr. Childers is a senior research analyst with the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Dr. Childers' work primarily focuses on state and local policy research and advocacy in the southern United States. Her research focuses on employment, earnings, job quality, and worker power. Dr. Childers, welcome to Furman.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for having me. I am with the Economic Policy Institute, or EPI. The Economic Policy Institute, we focus our work on creating a just society for workers. We are a nonpartisan and nonprofit organization, and we're dedicated to creating a strong, sustainable economy for all workers. I work at EPI with our state and policy research team, and we work with our research, policy, and advocacy groups in states across the nation. We have nearly 60 groups in 45 states, and I work in particular with our groups across the South. So I work with our groups, what we call our EARN groups, across 14 southern states. And we have our focus on the South because about 6 years ago, we made the intentional decision that we wanted to focus our work on the South, that we wanted to build up the progressive infrastructure, and we wanted to empower women and Black and brown workers across the region. And one of the ways we do this is by providing support to our groups, and this includes by encouraging and supporting cross-state work by our Southern groups so that they can work with each other, they can learn from each other, and they can share what works and what hasn't worked as they're beginning to work on building up the infrastructure. And so as I begin talking about my work on the South and the Southern economic development model, I think most of you here in the audience are probably aware of some of the basic facts. That across the South, we know that wages are lower, we know that poverty rates are higher, we know that families are struggling to be able to provide for their families. We know that healthcare, transportation, the cost of food, that all of these are struggles that our families across the region are struggling with. But what many people don't know or don't think about is the fact that these outcomes are actually the result of intentional policies that are in place across the region. We refer to these set of policies that create this as the Southern Economic Development Model. And I want to take a moment here and walk through some of the components of this model. As part of the history for this model, it can be traced back to the end of slavery. That was a period when wealthy white Southerners wanted to continue to access the labor of Black men and women with as little compensation as possible. The model includes low wages for workers. It includes a lack of regulation on businesses, a weak social safety net. It includes a stridently anti-union sentiment and policy. And I want to talk a little bit briefly about each of these. So first of all, low wages. This is one of the key hallmarks of the Southern Economic Development Model. And here, think about the federal minimum wage. The federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. That is where the minimum wage has been since 2009. So we're talking about 15 plus years, despite inflation, despite the higher costs of living. The failure to raise the minimum wage at the federal level, this is also an intentional decision. But we also know that states can raise the minimum wage for their states if they choose, and 30 states have made the decision to raise the minimum wage for the workers in their state. Most of those states, though, are outside the South. In most states across the South, the minimum wage is either the federal minimum wage or it is lower. States such as South Carolina don't have a state minimum wage. So the federal minimum wage applies here. And another piece of evidence for the intentionality of low wages is when the Biden administration tried to raise or did raise the minimum wage for workers of federal contractors, they were sued by Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi to keep those wages low. Next component is a lack of regulation on businesses. And here with this, we look at a couple of different ways that this lack of regulation impacts workers and impacts families across the region. So first of all, the lack of regulation, it means that many workers are exposed to hazards on the job. And here we're talking not just, about minor physical hazards, but it also includes, for example, loss of limbs and in some extreme cases, loss of life. A lack of regulation also means, for example, wage theft that we see is rampant when minimum wage and other wage policies are not enforced. So we see that workers who are not already facing lower wages are suffering from not receiving even the wages they are entitled to. And then the third component here is the impact for the broader community. So a lack of regulation means that quite often there are other harms to the broader community, and that includes environmental pollution, for example, which we know impacts the health and well-being of families across the nation. And then there is the regressive tax systems. And I think this is one that many people don't think about, because when we talk about taxes, what we generally think about is either taxes are low or high, or we think about income taxes. With the taxes, the regressive tax systems that we see in place, it's not that taxes are low or high, it's a greater reliance, for example, on sales taxes and fees rather than income or corporate income taxes. And when a greater focus of taxes is on sales taxes, that means low-income workers, low-income households, many of whom are already struggling to make ends meet, are spending a much larger share of their income in taxes than those who are wealthier and those who have more resources. The weak social safety net. This is also part and parcel of this model. In states across the South, we see that the social safety nets, one, tend to have much lower benefit levels, and they are harder to access. And these two features makes them much more difficult for workers who are facing economic hardships, but it also disempowers workers. Take unemployment insurance as one example. Unemployment insurance, in most cases, is designed to force workers to take the first job that comes along, even if it's not a job that's in their area of expertise, or it doesn't provide income or benefits that would allow them to provide for their families, rather than empowering workers to be able to wait until they found an opportunity that actually met their needs. And then the final piece of the Southern Economic Development Model, and this may be the most important piece of the Southern Economic Development Model, it is the opposition, the fervent opposition to unions in states across the South. The South was the first to have right-to-work laws in place. And these laws, they do not guarantee a right to employment. They do not ensure workers who want jobs have them. They are designed to undermine unions overall. And today, across the South, we have these laws in place, and they make it much more difficult for workers to organize and for unions to continue to thrive. And if you look at data for the South, we see that union coverage rates are much lower across the South than they are in states outside the South. And this piece is so important because the inability or the opposition to workers organizing and to workers forming unions is one of the ways in helping to maintain the Southern Economic Development Model. The way unions work is they bring workers together across lines of race, gender, nativity, whether you're immigrant or native born. It brings workers together. And those divisions are one of the ways that the population is kept divided, which strengthens the Southern Economic Development Model. Unions also increase political engagement among workers. It helps workers and their families, so it even goes beyond the workers themselves in helping them to engage politically and become involved in the political life of their communities and their cities. And this is important for undermining the Southern Economic Development Model as well. Each of these policies emerged following the end of slavery, and collectively, this Southern economic development model, it serves to provide higher poverty rates, to keep wages low, to make sure that workers don't have what they need. The model today, though, the roots of the model are covered over, and it's presented as a business-friendly way to attract jobs to communities. And the implicit promise that's associated with this model is that it will create prosperity for everyone, that by keeping wages low, and they would say low taxes, not regressive taxes, but these factors together are intended to attract businesses, and that's going to lead to a better outcome for everyone. That model was not designed to do that. It was not designed to create broad prosperity. It was not designed to ensure that everyone would do well, and so it can't achieve that end. And I think a good example of looking at a time when the model should have done this if it could was directly after the pandemic. So what we saw here, and again, if you look at infrastructure investments like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Sciences Bill, what these bills did was they led to a creation of lots of jobs across the South. Looking at data for South Carolina actually saw faster job creation, not only than the nation, but actually than the South as a whole. So this was a period when workers should have experienced that prosperity. And what we see is that the state also gave many subsidies to, and not just South Carolina, states across the South gave subsidies to these major corporations to locate jobs in their states. But what we see is that those subsidies and those investments did not trickle down to workers. When we look at data for workers' earnings, following the pandemic, employers across the South and in South Carolina could not find enough workers. There were complaints about not being able to get the workforce that they needed. And nationally, that forced employers to raise wages to bring workers into the workforce. And we see that wages rose by almost 4% nationally. But in South Carolina, wages rose by less than 1%. So even with the need for workers, there wasn't the investment. Overall, more workers in the South are paid less than $15 an hour than in any other region of the country. And in South Carolina, 18.5% of workers are paid less than that, compared to 12% nationally. And lower wages across the South are not a reflection of the lower cost of living. One of the arguments that is often put forward is that wages are lower, but the cost of living is lower, and so workers don't need wages as high. So we adjusted the median earnings to reflect differences across states in the cost of living. And states across the South still had lower earnings. Workers' earnings had lower buying power than in states outside the South. And it's not just wages. Workers across the South are also less likely to have health insurance, they're less likely to have pensions, and they're less likely to have paid family leave or paid sick days. So workers are less likely to have these benefits. And then there's the issue of the impact on the public schools across South Carolina. When we look at the subsidies that go to corporations, we see that it deeply impacts schools. South Carolina's public schools have reported a total tax abatement revenue loss that is greater than any other state in the country. So it's hitting those schools, and we've seen an increase in that, and that increase is greater in schools that serve students of color and low-income students. So all of these factors, these are the reasons that in my work, that I center workers across the South, that I focus on job quality for these workers. In part because I am many of these workers. I know what it feels like to earn very low wages. My first job out of school was as a server. I was about to say waitress. They're called servers. We were servers. And I made $2.13 an hour plus tips. This was in the early 1990s. It was in Texas. The restaurant I worked at was right across the street from a university. Today, whoever that worker is, whoever server number 8 is in that restaurant today, they are still earning $2.13 an hour plus tips, because that's the minimum wage for tipped workers. So I understand what it's like to try and raise and care for a family on low wages. But the lack of investments in workers, the lack of investments in a safety net, it means that, for example, parents don't have access to safe, reliable childcare. If the goal is making sure that people can work, that employers have access to the workers they need, parents without access to childcare don't have that. I was lucky, quote unquote lucky, because my mom, who was disabled, once my son got old enough to do things for himself, she could watch him for me. And that meant I could go to work and I could make sure and put food on the table. It also meant that I could then go to school and take classes and improve my skills. But working full-time and going to school full-time, it also meant that I missed out on a lot of things. And that, too, is another reason why I focus my energy and my work on job quality and workers and families across the South. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Childers, thank you so much for landscaping tonight's topic for us through your opening remarks, and you gave us a lot to think about. We're grateful for your introduction into some of the historic and current trends that hinder upward mobility among America's workforce, and especially in the South. So as we move to looking at solutions, we're honored to be joined in conversation tonight by leaders from our local business community. David Lominack is Commercial Market President of South Carolina for TD Bank. A committed community supporter, David has served as a leader on numerous boards connected to improving economic opportunities, including the South Carolina Chamber and Greenville Chamber, United Way of Greenville County, and the South Carolina Bankers Association, among others. And Ray Lattimore is founder, president, and CEO of Marketplace Staffing, a Liberty Fellow and graduate of both Leadership South Carolina and Leadership Greenville. He has earned the Senior Professional of Human Resources credential and is active on numerous boards in multiple organizations across the Southeast. David and Ray have actually served on multiple boards together and are both DLI Riley Fellows. So thank you all three for being in this conversation tonight. David and Ray, to kick off our discussion, I'd like to give you both an opportunity to share your initial reflections on Dr. Childers' opening remarks and how some of her points resonate with or differ from your own perspectives on the challenges impacting economic mobility for workers in South Carolina, particularly in the upstate. So David, let's start with you.
Good. Well, thank you, Julie, for having me. Dr. Childers, welcome back to Greenville. Ray, always good to be with you. This is a serious topic, but I need to start with something even more serious. And Julie did not tell you that I'm a Presbyterian College graduate. See, we're only going to go up from here. We blue hose don't get an opportunity to brag very much, so I apologize that we're doing that at Furman's expense. But in all seriousness, it is a pleasure to be here tonight. Listen, facts hurt sometimes. Data stings, especially when it's about your hometown, your home state. Ray and I and others in this room served on Greenville County's Racial Equity and Economic Mobility Commission, and that data really stung, where we were focused primarily on the black community in Greenville County. And what I've had to learn myself was I couldn't take it personally, and nobody was accusing me of creating the environment that we're in. And so what we did try to do, though, is really focus on the data and really focus on how do we improve the outcomes, okay? We can debate on how we got here. I'd really like to debate even more vigorously about what we do to solve the outcomes. I will tell you that this is a topic that is being discussed not only in Greenville County, but across the state. Just last night, I was in Columbia, so about quarterly 35 to 40 business leaders from across the state get together to talk about the challenges facing our state. Last night, we had William Floyd, who's the director of the South Carolina Department of Employment and Workforce. We had Dr. Tim Hardy, who's the president of the South Carolina Technical School System, and we had Ellen Weaver, who's superintendent, South Carolina Department of Education. For an hour and a half, that entire discussion was around how do we better improve the workforce for workers in South Carolina so that wages go up and all of the things that we're going to talk about in a minute become the byproduct of that. So I promise you that this is a topic that is resonating across the state and that will continue to be an important topic for all of us.
Right.
Good evening. So happy to be here with you this evening. My good friend David and I have served on many, many boards together just to tackle this specific issue. We come from different perspectives in life, but we're both from Greenville. Dr. Childers' address was spot on. If you look at the history of South Carolina, where we recruited major corporations to this state, and we offered them cheap land and cheap labor. And we're still living on that same model today. As most of you know, I own a company called Marketplace Professional Staffing. We've been in business for 29 years. We've employed over 80,000 employees. And at the wages that we're able to pay some of these employees, I don't know how they make it from day to day. You cannot make it at $18 and $19 and $20 per hour. So you're talking about upward mobility and climbing the ladder to get to the next rung. They don't even have a ladder to climb. And it's systemic. It's not their fault, it's our fault. We sit by, we read the news articles, we hear the news, and we say, oh, that's too bad, that's too bad. I would like to challenge each of you to get involved. David stood tall. I'm so proud of my friend David. For Ring, David and Gail, who sits over here from the Urban League, Carlos from the Greenville Chamber of Commerce, and David from TD Bank, put together a model of success. And we'll get more into the topics and the systemic problems that we're having even today as we go along with the program. So I'm excited to be here.
Thank you both. So thinking a little bit more about the state of worker income in South Carolina, the 2025 South Carolina Analyst report reveals that 42% of working families are making an income that doesn't match their basic cost of living. So these are some of the working families that are keeping our economy going: home health aides, delivery drivers, food service workers, child care providers, who are having to make decisions like whether to buy food or medicine, whether to pay the rent, or to the cost of an unexpected car repair, and the list goes on. So we know that income matters for workers, and I think this question remains as to how much it matters to the life and health of the businesses where they are employed. We've heard that these pro-worker policies and pro-business policies are often painted as opposite sides of partisan lines and inherently opposed to one another. But Dr. Childers, the Economic Policy Institute argues that really what's good for workers is typically also good for business and the overall growth of companies. I'm hoping you could share a little bit more about that perspective.
Yes, so we don't necessarily view those as being in conflict with one another. And so I think, first I'd like to say, I think a lot of business owners actually do want to be good business owners. They want to have high road models and they want to invest in their workers. But I think there are a few things that get in the way. One of those is the environment we're in now focuses on short term. It's, what are your quarterly earnings? It's looking at those short-term factors. Whereas investing in workers, one, I think about what it means for reducing turnover. If you've sat on hiring committees, it can take quite a bit of time and energy away from productivity, you reduce that, but that may not show up, especially in the short term if you're investing in your workers, if you're raising wages, if you're making sure that they've got these benefits. And so there's that emphasis, that push to focus on short-term things. I think also that another way that all the community can benefit is if we focus upon broader investments. And so there, instead of the discussion about tax breaks, investments in things like childcare, in transportation, I think those are things that not only benefit workers, but it benefits employers and it benefits communities in focusing on doing that work. And then I think another way that everyone benefits is simply, I call it, the Henry Ford of it all. Making sure your workers can afford your products, making sure they're able to buy the things. Those are the things that keep businesses when there's demand for the goods or services that they're buying. So those are some of the ways, that I view that investing in workers also benefits businesses and communities.
Thank you. Ray, I'd love to have you share your take on this same question of this idea of business interest and worker interest being in alignment or not, and do you have any examples locally of how this plays out?
Absolutely. As Dr. Childress mentioned, it doesn't have to be a conflict, but in many instances, there are conflicts where the entrepreneur, the business owner, reward profits over people. And I think what we need to do is focus on the people, and in turn, you will generate tremendous profits. If you look at BMW here in the upstate, it is an outstanding corporation. They have programs in place where you can come in as an entry-level employee, and they have one of the most robust training department there's anywhere in South Carolina, where you can come in as an entry-level forklift driver, you can move into a technical level 1, move into a technical level 2, and on into engineering. And as they go up that corporate ladder, they're able to support their family and buy houses and do nice things with their family. And speaking of transportation and housing, there's some things that we can do to improve the situation through public policy, and there's things we can do to improve the situation without public policy. If you take the economic development entities in town, as they align their resources for the better paying jobs that come to South Carolina, we got to make sure we have a skilled workforce. And I'm so very proud to say Greenville Technical College is represented here tonight, one of the best institutions not only in the state of South Carolina but the nation in training employees to get to the next level. So as a community, we've all traveled outside of the community, outside of South Carolina. We know what they're doing in other parts of the state. We're doing great work here in Greenville and South Carolina, and we just need to team up to do even better work.
Thank you. David, I think you would agree that there's a pretty strong business case for building upward mobility opportunities for workers, really beyond the ethical argument that it's just the right thing to do. So can you tell us more about how economic equity measures for workers make an impact for productivity and growth, not only in companies, but also in communities as a whole? And how is Greenville measuring in these areas?
Very good. Well, and Dr. Childress covered some of these points already. In its simplest form, if workers make more money, workers have more disposable income, workers spend more on goods and services in their community, and a community's economy is better, right? So it's kind of the rising tide lifts all boats theory. So, I think we can all agree with that. If I think about the community benefit, workers that make more money tend to have more financially stable homes, which will tend to break the cycle of poverty, which will put that family in a position to buy a home, which is one of the best ways to create generational wealth. It'll put this financially stable family in a position to access better health care, which puts less strain on the healthcare system, right? Financially stable communities have less crime. Financially stable communities attract business investment that I think will pay more than the minimum wage. From the company perspective, and I think Dr. Childers said it well, right? So if workers are being paid a fair wage for the job that they do, the assumption is they're going to do a good job and they're going to be happy at work. There's going to be less turnover in your company. You're able to sell more on the top line and hopefully you can make more on the bottom line. But you've invested in your workforce. Companies, and I think we're going to get to this in a second as well, but companies certainly have a part to play in providing the access to the resources and certifications and degrees and other things in support of their workforce so that they can move up the economic ladder. Now, that's all easier said than done. This is a complicated and a complex problem. It's not just as easy as saying, okay, companies, pay everybody more. There's so many more things to go into that, which is why I am pleased that across this state there are organizations like the technical school system and then state government and then companies themselves that are working together to do what we can to improve the workforce and close the skills gap that will ultimately lead to higher wages for employees.
Thank you. So, Chandra, zooming out a little bit beyond business level practices, what legislation or other types of public policies have you seen that have really helped to move the needle, whether that be in South Carolina or other nearby southern states, or what policies would you hope to see in the future in states across the Southeast that could advance further economic opportunities for workers?
Yeah, so I think one policy that we really are seeing move across the South, and including South Carolina, I think in 2022, South Carolina, they passed paid leave for public sector workers. Now, we want that for all workers, not just for public sector workers, but even beginning to make that difference because, and I think partly that may have been, I don't know necessarily in South Carolina, but for some states, it's a reaction to turnover in the public sector. But what we want is to see that continue to grow so workers have access to that. But I think other ways that you could really improve the economic outcomes for workers, for me, one of the simplest is simply raise the minimum wage. Most states across the South have not raised their minimum wage. And in some, like Florida, the lawmakers didn't raise it, so voters went to the polls and raised it themselves. But not all voters have access to that or can do that. So I think that's one, is raising the minimum wage. Thinking about the subsidies and the amount of money that goes to some of these corporations. I think if you had a policy in place requiring that for companies that receive these subsidies, that they are required to engage in community benefits agreements, for example. That way local communities can have a say in what benefits that go to that local community. And so that they make sure that their tax dollars are not just going to corporations, but it's actually coming back in. And these agreements, they're legally binding, and they can be used, again, for everything from child care and transportation to affordable housing. So I think those are some of the ways that we could definitely, and we've seen, some of the places I've seen community benefits agreements enforced, it's not because of the state, but in places where there's not, where the people don't necessarily have leverage to force it, you could have policymakers just make it a condition of the people's tax dollars that they're giving them anyway.
Thank you. David, knowing your deep experience in working with economic growth through your involvement with the Chamber and also many other efforts, I'd like to hear your perspective on what economic development initiatives have been particularly effective that you've seen in advancing upward mobility for people in Greenville or throughout South Carolina. I know Ray spoke to a few just earlier. And are there any new developments on the horizon that you hope to see in the near future that you think could be particularly promising for economic opportunity?
So I know education was last week's topic, I believe.
Yes.
Unfortunately, I wasn't here, and so I apologize if some of this is redundant. But in my opinion, all of this starts with education. So we still have 1 in 5 high school graduates graduating with just a high school diploma and not pursuing anything beyond just a high school diploma. There was a time where a high school diploma was enough. We're past that time. So we have got to make sure that high school seniors graduate either college ready or career ready. And I know that most K through 12 school systems across the state, as well as Greenville Tech, colleges, they are all working together to try to make that happen, but we've got to put even more focus on that. We've got to close the skills gap. I think Ray mentioned that, but that's where we have opportunities through the technical school system to get people additional associate's degrees, certifications, and I'm not going to go through the data, but they put it on the screen last night. You know, somebody in healthcare that was making $15 an hour gets a certification in healthcare through the technical school system, and a year later their salary is, 75% more than it was. So that does matter. Access to good jobs. We've got to continue to recruit big companies, but we've also got to recruit small companies. We've got to recruit entrepreneurial companies and those that tend to pay a higher average base salary. Transportation. That's a whole nother topic. I think all of us can agree that for some people, transportation is the barrier between a job and a much better job. I had the opportunity about 9 months ago to ride GreenLink. For those of you that don't know, that's the Greenville County bus. I rode it from downtown Greenville around the White Horse Road corridor and back. Clean bus, it was on time, it was great. There's not enough money, right? And it's one of those challenges. If we just had a lot more money, we could put it into transportation. But there are not enough buses, they're not going enough places, and they're not going often enough. And so how can we create public-private partnerships to help improve transportation? There are some really micro examples I heard an example of a company that gave the foreman for free a van, but his job is to go and pick everybody up to get them to work because they couldn't get there without transportation. So I do think there's some micro things that we can do, but we're going to have to look bigger across the state and clearly here in Greenville too. I'll raise my hand as the banker in the room. We've got to make sure that we provide access to capital for individuals that want to start businesses, for individuals that want to grow businesses, and for companies that want to relocate here. We've got to make sure that there is clear and consistent access to capital. I know we've touched on, I think you did, Dr. Childers, affordable housing, childcare, healthcare. Those are obviously all big topics, but those have to go into economic development initiatives too, because you can't have one without the other. You can have a great paying job, but if you have no childcare, it may be a challenge. I will just mention in wrapping up on this particular point, the South Carolina Chamber, one example of something that they're working on, it's called Blueprint 2035. And it's the Chamber's attempt to work across industry, both public and private, across the state of South Carolina to create the 10-year roadmap of what our economy should look like and then where we want it to go from there. The number one pillar on that is workforce development. And I do strongly believe if we can put a majority of our energy and efforts into making sure that we provide the environment and the ecosystem for workers to get whatever certification, degrees, solve some of these bigger issues or attempt to solve them, then we put people in a position to access higher wage jobs.
Thank you. Ray, I want to get your take on this too. Certainly as an entrepreneur in a business focused on staffing and also, of course, through your work with Greenville Tech, what trends in business practices do you really see making a difference for upward mobility for workers, especially post-pandemic? I think that Dr. Childers certainly spoke to some myths that maybe that led to a whole lot more economic mobility than perhaps it did with worker shortages and potentially wage increases. But what seems to be working and where are we struggling?
That question takes me back to the pandemic, where people was afraid to go places and then they were wearing masks and stuff like that. That was a really hard time for my industry because the federal government and state government relaxed all of their wage requirements in terms of you didn't have to go to work to get a check. So we're trying to find employees to send them to work, and they was making more money by staying at home than going to work. That was kind of sad, in my opinion, and it teaches bad habits. Then secondly, once we got through the pandemic, we got more employees ghosting us than any other time in the history of marketplace professional staffing, 29 years. And that was because it effectively rose the minimum wage, even though the federal and state law, but employees said, we're not going to go to work for a certain level of pay. And I think that was the best outcome of that. So employers had to raise their wages. I like to study major corporations and how they treat their employees. Only 3% of the corporations in South Carolina are unionized. I want to highlight one particular corporation called IPI, headed by a friend of mine by the name of Dennis Brush, where it is employee-centric. And they have a gym in their facility, they have a lunchroom in their facility, they have open seating where people can come to work. They work 4 10s and a half a day on Fridays. Some of the employees are hybrid. And employees want to go work at that one particular facility because of the way they take care of employees. We deal with corporations from all different nationalities. And I would tell you there's a difference between a Japanese company, a German company, an American company. And by and large, I prefer to work for an American company than the foreign companies that are here, and there's a lot of them here. David hit the nail on the head. It all relates to education. How we educate our citizens. We have programs in place, one called Ready SC, which is outstanding for new corporations moving to South Carolina. And transportation, to me, is the biggest issue. You have employers that need second and third shift employees, and they don't have a way to and from work. So if Greenville want to really improve the employment base and get in the wages and purchasing homes with assets-based and not the reverse taxes, then we really need to take a serious look at our transportation system here in South Carolina.
Thank you. David, what would you share along the lines of current trending challenges that businesses are facing today in recruiting talent? And what would you say maybe to some of the students in the room or others in the room who are hoping to position themselves for employment opportunities that really lead to better economic outcomes?
Yeah, I will say that one of the things that I heard yesterday in the meeting that I was in Columbia is that there is some low-hanging fruit, that it's just connecting skilled workers with openings. And I know that sounds so very basic, but they, on a statewide level, will admit that we've got to get better at the data and connecting some dots. And I recognize that my next few comments is probably more geared towards the students. But over the last 20 years, and Ray, I think you just kind of touched on this, we've seen a decline in soft skills. Right? So 20 years ago, you just kind of took for granted that somebody knew to show up on time, how to dress for the position, personal hygiene, communication, both written and, so look, I know some of you are giggling. We sometimes struggle to find people with the soft skills to do primarily customer-facing positions. And so I know that's becoming a bigger topic both in high school and in the technical system as well as colleges and universities. We've got to make sure that soft skills remain just as important as any other subject. I will say that companies, government absolutely have a part to play in helping someone move up the economic mobility ladder, period. Workers have to own a portion of that personal responsibility and accountability too. And so I would encourage you as students, If there are degrees that you need to get, if there are certifications that you need to get, if there are seminars you need to attend that improve your skill set, it therefore improves your marketability, which, you know what, that allows you to go hopefully get a higher paying job. I will say, and this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but sometimes we have employees come in and, you know, kind of day one, the door opens, y'all are welcome, I'm here. What are you going to do for me? Okay? It has to be a two-way street. Yes, the company needs to provide the environment for you to be successful and help you develop your career. Again, period. You got to do your part too. Okay? The last thing I'll say is, two more quick things. Network. You cannot network enough. Okay? So every opportunity you get to have a cup of coffee with somebody, visit with somebody in a meeting, be in a meeting, network as much as you possibly can. We were with a group of students earlier, and Ray said this. Our good friend Merle Code was speaking one time, and he went through a list of famous people that he knew, and I was in the audience, and I said, man, I've known Merle a long time. I didn't know he knew all those famous people. He got to the end, he said, but none of them know me. Okay, and those of you that know Merle, you can see him saying it. So it is important who you know, and it's also important who knows you. So make sure you are networking in those rooms and building your social capital, because ultimately that's how you get invited into jobs, into meetings, into rooms where decisions are being made. The last thing I'll say, and again, I'm sorry for the students that were with us before, because this will be redundant. I have, not as many as Ray, but I've looked at a lot of resumes in my career. And yes, I will peek at the GPA just out of curiosity. I am more interested in what did this person do outside the classroom. Did they play sports? Did they join a club? Did they hold leadership positions? Did they get engaged in campus life? Did they get involved in the community around campus? Did they have a part-time job? What are those things that make this a more well-rounded and likely more successful employee for our company? And so I encourage you students, consider that as you're working through your academic career. Yes, you got to go to class and you got to make good grades. That's kind of table stakes, but you've got to do these other things. And then when you get into the workforce, remember that after a few years, your GPA doesn't matter anymore, right? It's about what are you doing in your community, how are you rolling up your sleeves and being a part of the problem, not a part of the problem, part of the solution. Important distinction there. How are you being a part of the solution? How are you getting engaged? So just remember that, particularly there were some that were seniors and some juniors in the class earlier, and that's going to be important in the coming months.
Thank you, David. And Ray, I have one final question for you before we go on to our questions from our audience. Greenville, like many communities, has seen business growth that doesn't always necessarily translate to job growth for local residents. So we know that the skills, as David, you had spoken to before, and experience needed for some new jobs may cause companies to be seeking talent largely outside of the community rather than generating new opportunities for people who already live here. So how are we observing this trend showing up in Greenville, and what do you see being done to address that?
You know, that is a great question. You know, I often speak in terms of the young and brightest that grows up here in Greenville, South Carolina. They go off to college, but they never come back. And that is so sad because we need them back here. I think, you know, corporations moving into this area where you have 10,000 open job orders and then you got skill set that doesn't match up with the 10,000 skills. With the internet and AI, myself and corporations are recruiting all over the country, all over the world. I mean, we just filled a couple sales positions in Seattle, Washington. And we did that through AI and the internet. So most of these corporations, especially the white-collar corporations, are seeking talent from all over the world. If you walk down Main Street today, I guarantee you're going to hear at least 4 or 5 different languages as we walk down Main Street, because this is becoming an international city. And I think Greenville has a lot to offer. But for the ones in the audience, I want you to keep an eye on Spartanburg. They really got their stuff together there. I mean, they have this organization called One Spartanburg, and all of the economic development entities are under one roof, where they can share spaces, collaborate, and recruit major corporations into this area. Greenville has some of the finest, GADC, Greenville Tech, Upstate Alliance. But as it relates to how we fill these open positions, we're able to recruit worldwide. So if we don't have the skills here in Greenville, South Carolina, or even the state of South Carolina, we're going to go out and bring them in.
Thank you. Well, I've asked a lot, and I know we have some great questions from our audience, so we're going to take a few minutes. I'd like to ask our advanced team students to come to the podium and ask a few of the questions that our audience has submitted.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers tonight. Our first question is, how has the removal of DEI efforts affected your work in South Carolina?
I think that's a question for David.
Ooh.
You need Gail? Okay.
Yeah,
Gail is out there.
help, Gail. Listen, I will tell you from a personal perspective, at our company, we're doing the same thing today that we were doing a year ago and 2 years and 5 years ago, and DEI remains an important part of our DNA and our culture. Finding the best talent. And for us, it is about finding the best talent for the jobs in which we're hiring them to do. And particularly for customer-facing positions, our company needs to resemble the communities that we work in and that we live in. I will tell you, though, that we've talked a little bit about Greenville County's Racial Equity and Economic Mobility Commission. It's gotten very difficult to raise funds when there are some that suggest that if you give to these organizations that there could be penalties. And I think we got to work through that. But I think we can't lose sight of the fact that and again, if we just focus on Greenville County for a second, the data shows, and we had United Way commission a study, Racial Equity Index, the data clearly shows that the black community in Greenville is not where the white community is in almost every category. So let's put DEI aside for a second, and just for the sake of being humans and caring about one another, how do we create a level playing field for everybody so everybody has a chance to be successful? I know it's easier said than done, but that's, at the end of the day, it kind of needs to be that simple.
I think it starts with us.
Agree.
Thank you.
How do we change state incentives to incentivize not just number of jobs and cap investment, but focus on the growth of high-quality, high-paying jobs?
Let me take that.
Yeah, you already set me up once.
You're the smartest of the two. So, growing up in the inner city here in Greenville, and the reason that I am where I'm in today is because of two things. One is education, and one is economic development. And our laws in the state of South Carolina doesn't match up with what we're trying to accomplish today. We give these huge fee in lieu of taxes, to major corporations that offer manufacturing. But what about the skilled physicians? What about call centers? What about educators? What about all these white-collar positions that we need? This economy in South Carolina was set up based on, number one, you may not know this, you may do, this was a forestry economy. I mean, that's what we did. Trees and farm and things of this nature. Then we went into, there was cotton first, then there was forestry, and then we moved into manufacturing, the textile capital of the world, where we have mill village houses where the employees live in the houses, and at 4 a.m., somebody at the plant flipped the switch, and everybody in the whole town wakes up, and they had to be at the job. And that's how they paid their rent, through their work. So forget about minimum wage. It was no wage. And then we moved textile, and then now we're trying to move into a knowledge-based economy, and we're not ready. But there are things in place that are moving us along the way. But as David said, forget about that. If we don't take care of each other one-on-one, individually, and respect each other, we'll never make it. So a lot of companies are not looking at the skills, what certificates you have. They're looking at, can you do the job? And they don't care if you have a high school diploma, a PhD or not. Can you do the job? And that's where we are in today's society.
One more question.
This question is
Are places that have robust public transportation and accessible, affordable childcare wealthier than places without these services? What do those places do to encourage public transportation and affordable childcare?
I have not looked to compare communities. Well, we do know that some of the wealthier communities do have access to these items. But I don't think that we can say anything about a causal relationship there, because that's not what we've looked at. How do we incentivize? I think for many of these things, and we have a system that's set up where the incentives, I do believe, are often perverse. And that people if people can get elected on certain things, that's what they focus on what gets them elected and what gets them reelected. And so I think the same goes with ensuring that we focus upon providing, again, the idea of workers having the skills that they need, but we're draining money away from the schools that's supposed to train them and provide them with the skills that they need. Those are things that I think it comes down, and I don't live in I don't live here, but no matter where you live, who you vote for, being active in the things that you expect from those that are put in power to represent you and to put in place policies that will impact you, your neighbors. I think all of that is very important, and that includes focusing on making sure that people have the transportation, that people are trained, that people, one reason that some businesses may not invest in training workers is a concern that they'll invest and train them and then someone else will take them away. Whereas if we make sure that all of our workers are trained, if we make sure that everyone has those skills, then that becomes less of an issue. And so I think focusing, in how the things that we prioritize in our lives and that we prioritize when we are politically active, not just voting, but all of our political activities. That's really, I think, the only way that I see to incentivize that.
Thank you. And thank you to our students and to our audience for those
Yes.
questions. We're almost out of time, but I do have one final question for all three of you. The passion that each of you hold for making the American dream more accessible is clear through your work, through your community involvements. What's your message to that person sitting in our audience tonight who may be thinking that they care a lot about these issues as well, but feeling as if there's really nothing that they can do to influence change or make things better? And Dr. Childers, let's start with you.
I think depending on where people stand, that they have, that there are different things people can do. One thing was mentioned earlier is people, they don't care about your grade or what you got in class. They care about you having the skills. And so I think if you're an employer, that's one of the things. And that's something I've worked for as well, is looking at people who maybe can't afford to go to college, but they've been able to get the training in some other way or build up those skills. But I think even for, people who aren't in those positions of power or of hiring, for me, a lot of it was people who looked at me and saw potential and just came up and said, hey, you would be great. Are you thinking about grad school? Because you should be. Or, people who brought me onto their projects, who were like, the work that the vision I heard you talking about, that's really important. We're going to support that. So I think and I always think about it as either being a mentor or a sponsor, depending on how much of an investment. But looking for those that you can lift up, that, those are, I think one of the key things that I think about is when we have, people come through, especially those that don't come from families with that background, what are ways that I can support them and let them know that, that whole imposter syndrome thing is very real, and help them to know that they are, that what they're doing, that they are worth it, they are good.
Thank you. David?
Agreed on everything there, and I would say even beyond a mentor, be a sponsor for an individual within your company that you can help bring along and help them move up that economic mobility ladder. Look, the challenges we face both on what we talked about tonight and other topics that this series is trying to address are big. So you're not going to wake up tomorrow morning and go, I'm going to figure out this workplace thing by 5 o'clock this afternoon. You've got to just pick small areas where you can get engaged, educate yourself, and as I was talking about earlier, you just got to be willing to roll up your sleeves and raise your hand, because I promise you there are organizations in Greenville, there are organizations across the entire state who would love to have any help that they can get, whether it's research help, collecting data, analyzing data, whatever it is. But you just got to raise your hand and get involved. And I do agree that all of this comes down to the street level, if you will, right? I mean, just figuring out what you can do in your local neighborhood. Again, start small, but please, if you run across an idea that works in your local neighborhood, then share it so we can do it in a community, and then do it in a town, and then do it in a city. That's how some of these ideas are born anyway.
We all have passion for what we love and what we want to see right about our community. My simple message is to get involved. I was just graduated from college, and a mentor of mine got me involved with the United Negro College Fund. And I was raising money for HBCUs that I didn't attend. And 2 or 3 years later, he asked me, I need you to head this organization. And I was 27 years old. We raised money for kids to go to college. Then people in the community recognized that. A gentleman by the name of Hayne Hipp asked me to come serve on his Alliance for Quality Education Committee. I served there with Hayne, and former Mayor Max Heller was there, and Bill Page and others, and I got to know people. And then from there, they asked me to serve on the United Way Board and the Greenville Chamber, South Carolina Chamber. So get involved. It takes a village. It takes all of us. As David mentioned, these are big, massive items that we need to tackle, but they're not insurmountable. I think we can change the transportation system. I think we can better equip employees for the workforce. I think we can build workforce affordable housing. I think we can do all of this, maybe not in my lifetime, but if we work together, it's achievable. So my message to you, especially the students, is to get involved in something that you're absolutely passionate about.
Thank you all, and a special thanks to our attendees for joining us this evening and for your care in this critical series. So next Tuesday, during our final session, we are going to be joined by Harvard professor and world-renowned economist, Dr. Raj Chetty, to talk about how the places where we live impact our access to economic opportunity. He'll be joined by some local Greenville leaders as well to reflect on how his research and policy recommendations connect to local economic mobility opportunities here in Greenville. So it's another session you're not going to want to miss. And finally, as we wrap up tonight's session, Chandra and David and Ray, we are so deeply grateful to all three of you for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, and most importantly, your passion through this rich discussion. So on behalf of our students, our faculty, staff, and wider Greenville community, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all again, and good night.